Hello and welcome to another episode of the Time for Impact podcast with me, Chris Wade, my co-host.
Hi everyone, I'm Matt Cobble. Thanks for listening.
Hopefully you know by now that every episode we like to celebrate the innovation and creativity of our colleagues across the sector, doing imaginative things in volunteering, sometimes bringing you a well-known organisation that you know about, sometimes bringing you somebody you might not have heard of so much about in the past. We don't mind as long as it's innovative and we can learn something from it. And today on the podcast, we have Amy Stow from Shift.MS. Hi, Amy.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
No, welcome. And Matt and I have been following your organisation for some time with a lot of interest in what you do. So maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your role, but most importantly, of course, about Shift.MS and where volunteering is involved in that.
Yeah, sure. I'll start by talking a little bit about me and my background, because that might help shape a little bit how I got to where I am now. So I've been working in volunteer management for about 14 years. I started in the cultural sector, mainly museums and heritage. That's where I started my career. And it was kind of assumed that to be in that industry, you did a lot of volunteering. So I definitely started my volunteering career, so to speak, at uni. I understood the value that it could sort of bring to my skills and my experience. And then as I got older and moved around, it became quite important for me to make friends and integrate into new places. I'm currently a trustee of a local museum service. So partly because I don't work in heritage anymore and I miss it because I love history still, and partly because I really enjoy sharing my skills, to be honest. So I started at Shift.MS in 2017, so I've been there for just over 6 years now, and I was brought in as community engagement manager, and my role was really to help improve the co-production and involvement of MSers at the organisation. And as we built the team and have grown a little bit, my role's kind of changed and evolved. We're still quite a small organisation, so my role is now head of operations, so I do a whole host of different things, but I'm still very much involved in working with the community. So Shift.MS is a digital community for people with multiple sclerosis. We offer social and emotional support, hopefully trying to inspire people with MS to take charge of their health as soon as possible after diagnosis. So our role is to help people adapt to their diagnosis and also to make really important decisions at key points in their life with MS. So for those who don't know anything about MS normally strikes people when they're in their 20s and 30s. The average age of diagnosis in the UK is 31. So it's quite a key pivotal moment in your life when you're trying to make sense of who you are, trying to think about career, maybe getting married or having children or buying a house, or all those kind of big decisions that you make in your 20s and 30s. So we exist to try and help tackle some of those big questions that people have. And the way that we do that is through lived experience, people with MS kind of sharing their stories. So we're all about involving our beneficiaries, I guess, in the delivery of the work that we do and our services. And I think we're maybe a little bit different from other organizations in the fact that we were started by somebody who has MS. So from the get-go, so we started in 2009, so we're about 15 years old now, and we essentially were born out of a need from somebody who had MS. So we have that everyone being involved from day one, which is perhaps quite unusual in comparison to some other organizations.
Could I jump in, Amy, with a question? Because that sounds really interesting. So Shift.MS starting in 2009, that's different certainly to a lot of the charities and organizations I've been involved in, probably very different to the heritage sector as well. 2009 is the digital age. Social media is perhaps a little bit more in its infancy than it is today, perhaps not quite part of all of our lives that it is now. But, it's an organization started in a very much a digital age. How has that affected kind of the organization's approach to the way it delivers its service, but perhaps most significantly, the way it involves volunteers and what volunteering means in an organisation that's created in 2009 as opposed to an organisation that was created in 1949, for example. Yeah.
The way that Shift.MS was born, so to speak, is so our chief exec, George Pepper, was diagnosed at 22. So this was back in 2006. And he really just struggled to find the support that he needed. At 22, you're probably going into the world of work, and he found a lot of the support structures just weren't fit for purpose for him. It was always during the day, it was in person, he had to go to a particular place, he had to take time out of work. There's all those kind of elements. So for him, and the fact that there just wasn't people who were similar to him, so his solution was to create a digital platform where he could meet other people. So in some respects he created it for himself, but very quickly found that there was a gap in provision for particularly newly diagnosed young people with MS. There's some great, amazing MS charities out there that do amazing work, and things have moved on a lot in 15 years. But at that time, digital was, I don't really think it was being utilized at all. People had maybe had a website presence, but that was basically it. George started Shift.MS as a digital platform. So we've always been digital. We've never had a physical presence anywhere. So that has already put us on a front foot in comparison to any other organization in a lot of ways. So it's given us lots of opportunities to do things differently. There's lots of opportunities, lots of challenges as well. But one of the opportunities is it allows us to work with people in a really flexible way. So you don't have to go to a particular place to do a particular thing at a particular time. You can, a lot of the work that people with MS that are involved in our work do it's all remote, it's all virtual, because that's the type of organization that we are. So there's a huge amount of flexibility in it. It allows us to reach just quite a diverse range of people as well. So we're not restricted to a particular area, and that brings challenges in itself. I live in York, which is one of the least diverse places probably in the UK when you kind of look at population. Whereas when you're doing obviously you've got to have some sort of level of digital literacy, but for the audience that we're trying to reach, which is young people, I mean anybody under the age of probably 45, to be honest, that's kind of our key demographic. That's kind of where they are. So we want to meet people where they are, rather than saying, oh yeah, you can get that support, but it has to be within this specific boundary that we've created.
And that seemed to allow you to be quite international as well. You haven't got those geographical boundaries either, have you? Although I'm sure there's some cultural challenges that come with that. But
yeah, absolutely. So we are based in the UK. All of our team are based in the UK, with the exception of the occasional freelancer. But most of us are in the UK. But yeah, our audience is across the world. It is global. And we have people that work with us across 15 different countries, but we're also English speaking. So most of those people are in English speaking countries. And after the UK, the US is probably our biggest kind of growing audience. And obviously the US is absolutely massive. So there's kind of lots more people that we can support and involve in our work as well.
Yeah. I think Matt's hit on a really interesting thing really there, because most of us have, well, we've certainly worked in some quite traditional, well-established or long-established organisations. And when you try to introduce digital ways of working, there's often lots of enthusiasm, but you tend to end up replicating offline solutions in online manners, or you have to sort of take a part of your volunteering audience or even your staff with you on that journey, where they're not always digitally native or enthusiastic. There are some challenges that come with that, where you probably have managed to avoid a lot of that, I imagine.
Yeah, I think part of it is you have to be willing to give up a certain level of control, I guess, when it comes to being virtual. It's a little bit like, obviously the world has changed quite a lot because of 2020, COVID-19, the pandemic, lockdowns, all those kind of things. That has changed the way that we work. It didn't change really the way that we worked, because we were already pretty much working in that way anyway. But I think that kind of opened people's eyes a little bit. But you trust your staff to do their job, and why would you not afford the same trust to the people that volunteers, people that kind of support you and kind of give up their time? So I think there is a certain concern around quality, I suppose, that you can't monitor when you're not physically in the same place as somebody. You're kind of not watching them. I think there's probably some concerns around that. And I mean, we have the same concerns, but I think for us, because of the nature of how we started and the fact that we've always done it this way, I think we just inherently have to have a level of trust in people. And the key thing that people are doing for us is sharing their experience, and you can't really do that wrong.
I think the trust point is really interesting. I often find myself talking about that, in kind of more sort of sector-wide conversations, and it always makes me feel a bit disappointed that like trusting volunteers to do things always feels a bit more radical than it should. Let's not say like, there are some fantastic organizations out there that are placing huge amounts of trust and responsibilities in sort of expert volunteers. Just wish it was sometimes more widespread and it didn't seem as radical as maybe it does sometimes. And and the fact about whether you pay someone or not, for me is not the deal breaker on like whether they're going to do a good job on something or whether they're passionate about something. It isn't part of it for me.
And when I think about some of the experiences I've had with working with volunteers across my career, we've put some amazing trust, actually. The responsibility that some people, and again, I'm thinking specifically about museums and heritage, and that's a big part of my career. And then I moved into health, and so I appreciate there's I'm sure lots of different experiences across volunteering in general. But we used to let people open up buildings for us, and literally give people keys to do things. When you look at even big organisations like National Trust, they rely on volunteers to do that. There's a huge amount of responsibility that goes into it, so you have to trust. And like you say, why is it different?
I always like to point out, people going out on lifeboats, our mountain rescue services. Shout out to my former organisation, Riding for the Disabled Association, who are making, choices about delivering quite a risky sporting activity. Volunteers can bring expertise to things like that anyone else can, right? It always feels to me like our job as organisations is to provide the right structures, the right support, right infrastructure to enable them to use their skills, to develop their skills, to do things safely, appropriately. The trust issue is not about whether someone gets paid or not for me. Like it's interesting. I think the other thing you touched on for me as well was like flexibility. And I think that's really interesting as well, because it feels like certainly over my career in the sector, like it feels like basically we've always been talking about the need for volunteering to be more flexible. Like it seems like an eternal conversation, if that makes sense. And in some instances, like it feels like sometimes we're guilty perhaps of trying to make what were like structures that weren't designed to be that flexible more flexible, which isn't always that compatible. What Shift.MS seems to have had an opportunity to do, I don't know, I'd be interested in your reflections on this, is like, because you're creating something from the get-go that is truly flexible, you've got something that is like, that is flexible by design, rather than something that we're trying to re-engineer to make it flexible when really it's not flexible. And I think that's quite cool, and something we might be able to learn from, which is maybe we need to think about new ways of doing things rather than trying to make the things we've already got more flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. And don't get me wrong, we've not got everything right because you can't possibly get everything right. But I think, I agree. We've definitely created ways to make things flexible for people, but we're always learning. And I think one of the challenges that being in a big organization where you have hundreds, thousands of volunteers is, how do you get to know people, individuals, and how they might want something to be? Because you kind of have to design for the masses rather than a specific person. So we work with somewhere between 250 and 300 people every year. So a decent amount, given that we're a small team of 10, but we're not talking about thousands of volunteers here. And we kind of like that because we get to know people. We get to know people individually. So if somebody says, actually, that thing, I don't really like it when you email me about that, could you give me a call? And it's really silly things like that. Just realizing that everybody is unique and individual, and actually they don't want to be emailed because it might get lost, or that's just not a way that they like to communicate. For us, because all of our volunteers have MS, there is challenges around dexterity, there's challenges around cognitive memory things. So we need to make sure that whatever we're providing is right for that person. Like I said, we don't always get it right, but we try where we can. That's why building relationships with our volunteers is so incredibly important. And we have this amazing program called the Buddy Network, where we match somebody who's newly diagnosed in the first kind of, ideally as soon as possible, but for us, that's kind of the first 2 years, with somebody who's a little bit more experienced, a little bit further on down their journey. And essentially, it's just to provide that listening ear. It's kind of like a mentorship type program, but it's a little bit less formal than that. And the volunteers are the buddies, so the experience side of it. So we normally have between 100, 110 buddies at any one time. And the person that coordinates that program, we obviously have a process that we follow, because you have to have some sort of structure, but they're so good at being like, oh, that bit of the process doesn't work for that person, so I'm just going to mix it up slightly and I'm going to just kind of change it around. And they can do that because they know what that individual is like. They know what might cause anxiety. They know that actually memory is not their strong point. So actually doing it this way around rather than that way around works better for them. But en masse, that's really difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
So I don't have a solution for that, but yeah.
I wonder if the fact that you're an organisation run by people with MS for people with MS has a bearing on that. I was thinking that co-productive ethos that runs through the heart of everything you do, whether that makes you more solution focused than risk focused compared to other organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our internal culture, and I don't want to bring marketing too much into it, but we have a very specific brand. And I think that brand really resonates with with our key demographic, as you would hope. And we try and live and breathe that brand. And I think that just informs how we work. And like I said, because we were established with somebody with MS, that by MSers for MSers, it's just already there. Like there's no, in some respect, I was trying to reflect on this a little bit earlier on, and I was like, I don't even know if we think about it too much. I think we've just created this environment and this place where it just kind of happens. It's just sort of expected. And I was kind of thinking, like, how do we do that? Because, you have to create a culture somehow. I think part of it is, like I said, having that kind of starting point, having George as our chief exec, that sort of being so inherent. The fact that for the first 3 years of our organisation, we were completely ran by volunteers. There was no paid member of staff when we first started. We didn't have any funding. So it wasn't until 2012 we actually recruited our first person, and their role was community coordinator. So that was all about getting people with MS involved. That was the first ever role that we recruited. Again, that is sort of inherently in that culture. We probe it at recruitment, at interview. There's an expectation that you will work with our community. Onboarding, there's an expectation that you will have, you will meet people with MS. We arrange for people to have 2 phone calls within their first 2 weeks with members of our community, so they have that understanding. But I also think our makeup is just so different from a lot of organisations. Like I come from a charity background. Our fundraiser, head of fundraising, comes from a charity background. And that's it. The rest of the team are from creative backgrounds. And so I do think that changes how people see how we work with our community, because they don't have that, this is what we do, this is a volunteer, this is the box that we put people in, this is the program that we run, these are the processes that we do. They kind of don't have that inherent baggage, I guess, that kind of comes with having a volunteer program.
While we're on brands, I would love to talk a little bit about some things I just think are brilliant about Shift.MS from a branding perspective. So the first one is the energy. I won't say any more than that, but I'll let you unpack that in a minute and what that means. Other thing that I'd probably just like to shout out to anyone listening to this podcast, anyone involved in volunteer management listening to this podcast, if you want to see a great example of a volunteer handbook, go and look at the Shift.MS handbook. It is brilliant. It is not like any volunteer handbook you have ever seen anywhere, and it's totally brilliant. Page 3 says, "Why have you sent me this?" As an example of how brilliant it is. So I'll pass over to Amy to talk about some of that branding, the energy, and what that means at Shift.MS, really.
Our brand is it is incredibly strong, and we use this term bittersweet a lot in our branding, and it's this thing of MS is a terrible thing that happens to people, but it also provides opportunities as well. So we try and have that kind of balance, but also we are just so much more informal, I think, again, than a lot of big organizations. And that is actually quite a struggle. I remember coming when I first started at Shift.MS, things like were really specific, like you use contractions. It's not you are, it's your, because it's more conversational. So we try and make sure that in anything that we're creating, it sounds like we're having a conversation with somebody. It doesn't sound like this kind of stuffy, I think we have something probably in there about GDPR, and it's like eye roll, because you have to cover these things, but how can you do it in a way that sort of is like, yes, we know this is annoying, but we kind of have to tell you this thing. And we kind of have tried to see that when we talk about the energy as well. So for those who aren't aware, that's kind of what we call those who are involved in our work. The kind of collective group is the energy. Well, we talk about them as the energy which keeps Shift.MS alive, keeps us going. And this kind of has been inspired partly by George's experience, but actually I've heard this so many times from other people that I've spoken to within our community, is that you're diagnosed with this long-term health condition, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, this thing has happened to me. And I don't know whether it's like a rush of endorphins or what it is, but this feeling of the immediate reaction is, I need to do something. I need to do it now, and it needs to be positive. And so that's kind of where it's come from, this kind of rush of energy. And I was looking back at some of our previous impact reports, and there's a brilliant quote from somebody who basically said exactly that without us prompting. They said, being involved at Shift.MS has given me a sense of taking action against my MS and channeling it into something good. So because all of our volunteers have MS, for us, the really important part of it is making sure that there's a positive impact at the other end, right? They're helping us, they're helping others, but they also need to help themselves as well. So it's a very two-way relationship. But yeah, the energy is kind of how we describe those people who are involved in our work. We tend not to use the word volunteer. If I can just talk a little bit more about the sort of branding, I think volunteer is a really tricky word. I think there's lots of challenges that I find personally with volunteer, but we all kind of understand what we mean when we say volunteer, particularly within the third sector. When somebody says volunteer, you broadly understand what that means. But I think as you understand what that means, it also means that you generally come with a bit of a biased perception of what a volunteer is, what they might look like, how they might act, all those kind of things. We've already talked about trust. I think like problem-solving procedures is something that pops into my head when I think about volunteers as well. I mean, maybe we can get onto that in a little bit because I have strong feelings about that too. But if you were to actually ask, well, certainly we asked the energy last year. We asked them to describe the work they do for us. We didn't ask, do you call yourself a volunteer? Because we don't want to be too leading. But at no point did anybody say, oh yeah, I'm a volunteer. Everybody just described what they did, or said, oh, I'm a buddy, or yeah, I did a social media takeover, or kind of whatever it might have been. But not at any point did anybody use the word volunteer. And not even say I'm a volunteer and then elaborated. It just wasn't used at all. And we sort of suspected that would be the case. So we were like, I mean, again, internally, we're quite clear with the language. We were like, we just won't use the word volunteer anymore because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't resonate with the people that we work with. Externally, we talk about volunteers because it's what everyone understands. Like if I was to say the energy, people would be like, what? But if I said the word volunteer, people kind of have that understanding. But internally, the energy is what we use. We even have a little lightning bolt. That's our little branding for it as well. So it comes with its own brand in itself, and people get it. Like MSers in our community get it. And that's the most important thing for us. It has to resonate with them.
Amy, can you tell us a little more about the roles and activities that are available within the energy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've already talked about the fact that we're a digital organisation, so all of our roles are virtual, and they're sort of probably like most organisations broadly split into sort of one-off minimum commitment and then kind of regular and ongoing stuff. Our one-off roles are, we do social media takeovers, so that's Twitter, X, and Instagram stories. And that's normally over a weekend. And we started that quite a long time ago. And it's an incredibly successful program of work, which is just the lowest effort for any organization, which is to just hand over the keys to your social media channel for the weekend. Just be like, just share what you're up to, share what's on your mind. Because it's a real person sharing their real experiences of day-to-day life living with MS, it's where we get the most interaction. It's where we get the most engagement. It's what people want to see. They, I don't want to say they don't care about organizations, but organizations are kind of faceless and sort of not human, I suppose, in a lot of ways, where seeing a person is certainly what our community want to see. So that's something that we've done for a very long time, and starting with X and then moving across to Instagram stories in the last kind of 4 or 5 years. So that's kind of a weekend of time, I suppose, but fairly low barrier. Then we have bloggers, again, sharing their story. It's just in a different format, written. Not everybody is great with either social media, doesn't want to be on camera, whatever it might be. Bloggers, and we do have some regular bloggers, and then we also have kind of one-off bloggers as well. Then we have video content creators. So we often kind of create video content around specific themes. So we've just done a huge piece of work around womanhood and MS, because MS affects more women than it does men. So we did it kind of almost like podcast style, but it was filmed. But basically, 4 or 5 women kind of talking about their experiences. That was kind of done in a studio, so it was kind of a one-off thing, but slightly more intense. But we do kind of ask people to record their own stories at home via their phones or via laptops, etc. as well. So we kind of have that more kind of user-generated content, I suppose. And then we have sort of the regular kind of ongoing roles, and they're broadly split between social media and our platform itself, the website that we have. So we've already talked about takeover hosts, but we also have takeover managers. So I have somebody who is a takeover manager for X and somebody for Instagram stories. They're somebody with MS themselves. It's actually great. The thing that I love about takeovers is basically our community does it themselves, because the hosts go out and find people. They essentially recruit people. And they say, do you want to do this date? Yeah, okay. They organize it all. They do all the sort of intro and the prep for people, and then kind of do the follow-up afterwards as well, and the evaluation. So they're a great ongoing role. Then we have social media commentators as well, as people who man our inboxes, and also people who reply to comments. Again, we're an MS-led organization. We can do our stock answer as staff, but it's not the same as somebody who's actually just looking for somebody to empathize and be like, oh yeah, I've been through that too. Then we have buddies, which I've already talked about. We also have platform ambassadors, so people who are on we have a forum, it's people who are on there who can point people in the right direction to additional resources, or potentially just kind of flag perhaps where they have concerns about people, so that maybe we can get in touch with them. And then we're very exciting this year. Hopefully, we're about to release an app. So it will be the equivalent of our site, but a lot more accessible for our target audience, which is due to release hopefully in the next couple of months. So we currently have a cohort of about 200 people who are beta testing our app as well.
Brilliant. And I've got to say, some of the video content your site is absolutely amazing. I was watching one just before I came on with Simon Day. I don't know how you get these people involved. Simon Day dressed up as Elvis. That's all I'll say for listeners. Some absolutely brilliant content out there, and it's well worth watching.
Yeah, well, like I said, we're a creative organisation, so we do have lots of different video content, which is it's some of our strongest stuff, I must admit, but very lucky that we work in that kind of organisation as well.
There's a really interesting point around sort of membership there, and sort of membership is something that Chris and I have talked about many times, perhaps not so much on this podcast yet, but I'm sure we'll talk about it more in the future. But the notion of like membership, firstly as a community, which I think is really interesting and important, which seems like a key part of Shift.MS, but also that ability for people to become a member as an entry point, but then sort of do things as a member, like be an active member, not just be someone on a mailing list that receives a magazine or a newsletter, or not just someone who is effectively kind of a consumer receiving things and taking things from the organization, but someone who is a member who can be active and participatory as part of a community. And how we can make that as easy as possible and as frictionless. It seems like that's something that, early or not overtly, but you've certainly given some thoughts to that, and it seems like you're making steps to sort of make that kind of line between being a recipient of a service but also being an active participant in it from a membership perspective really fluid and easy as possible.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot. Certainly, we talk about it a lot. And a couple of years ago, we sort of looked at, I can't remember what we called it now. It wasn't the participation journey, because everything is a journey in our organisation. So I try not to use the word journey, because I feel like we probably overuse it a little bit. But I kind of see some of those sort of low touch, low barrier to entry, sort of one-off roles as kind of being the top of the funnel. And how can we get as many people in the top of that funnel? And then how can we, it's almost like you do with donors, right? How do you get as many people in the top, and then you try and steward them so that they donate more? And, you know, the lower down you get the funnel, the less people there are, but the more time they give, et cetera, et cetera. And we kind of, not intentionally, but kind of see it in that way, I think. And often for us, it's about building a relationship. And I guess you kind of build that loyalty as well between you and the person that's giving up the time. So we'll often find that somebody who's done a social media takeover will come back to us and say, that was brilliant, I'd really like to do that again. Or is there another way that I can get involved? And suddenly you find that you've got this group of people who started with a takeover here and are now like involved in like 6 different things that we do, because they've built up that relationship with us and they like what we do. I think there's also, again, I don't know how this works across other organizations. I would imagine in health it's probably quite similar. But I think you get to a point where you want to help people in ways that you weren't helped when you were first diagnosed. So I always kind of see it in 2 halves. One is the start of that journey where you're like, I just want to hear other people's stories. That's the key thing. I just want to understand other people's experiences, and I want to consume content. I want to consume information. I want to consume experiences. And then the other side of it is you get to the point where I want to share my story, because I wish somebody had shared my story when I first was diagnosed so that I could see other people living with MS who are like me. And that's great, because you end up in this great cycle. And, you know, people who were diagnosed are always going to move on further down their journey. You know, they're only going to be newly diagnosed for a very short period of time, and then they're going to convert to the other side. So how can we convert those people who are sort of 3, 5, 10 years into their diagnosis into being active participants?
I think that mindset thing around that is so key, though, because like all the time in the sector, I hear the fundraising conversation about the supporter journey, the funnel, the getting people in, the stewardship. I hear it much less frequently in the volunteering people side of it, which is, you know, we get people in and then we give them options. I feel like sometimes in the volunteering side, we get them in and we put them in a role that suits our organization and we keep them there. Whereas actually that mindset of what is the journey for someone who wants to give us time? And that could mean all sorts of things at different points, people moving in and out of things. Like there's a really interesting piece of, I don't know, research maybe, but like it's quite old now, but it's worth a shout out. And I think it's really still good for people to read if you've never read it. I think it's over 10 years old. It's called Pathways to Participation, I think, or Pathways Through Participation. And it kind of, it was talking about like how people move in and out of different things, different how different life experiences effectively affect their volunteering. And to me, that really speaks to the importance of these journeys for people, because we don't just want to get people in and put them in a role and keep them there forever. What we want is for them to have opportunities and to sort of make their own choices about how they give their time based on how their life works, right? And, maybe that's the key to involving different people. I don't know. It feels like, for me at least, it's one of the things and one of the ways we could all be thinking a bit differently about this.
Yeah, I think my experience, and I will talk about my own experience. I used to work for RNIB, and yeah, I feel some of that. And I think, I don't know whether as volunteer managers, we just end up gatekeeping a little bit as well. And we're like, no, this person's mine, and they couldn't possibly do anything else. When, that's exactly the opposite attitude that we should be having. And I do wonder if there's something about our demographic of volunteers that, because they are generally younger, that we're maybe just a bit more open and flexible. And, we really don't have that many people who volunteer with us who are retired. They don't have that same time. So we're like, we appreciate that you're at work. during the day, and therefore daytime stuff doesn't work for you. So having to do something during the day is not a thing that works. So again, I just wonder if it's just what we're used to working with. And just, and never really got the, why can't this be done at a different time?
I sometimes like to use the analogy of a trunk and the branches of a tree. If you think of membership or citizenship or people's active participation and involvement in an organisation or a cause, if you think of the trunk being people's involvement in that cause, and the branches being, one branch might be their involvement in fundraising, one branch might be their involvement as a consumer, reading information and so on. Another branch might be the volunteering involvement, and there might be different sub branches for different types of volunteering. I think all too often we focus as teams on nurturing the branches, yet we neglect the nurturing of the trunk of the tree and keeping people involved in that organisation first and foremost before they get involved in getting nutrients out to those individual branches of the tree.
And I do think as well there is something about, because like I said, we're a team of 10, so we are quite small, that actually people generally know our names or know some of us quite well, which perhaps again is a little bit unusual from some other organisations. Again, because our organisation skews probably closer towards our demographic as well. Like, we're creative and we're quite ambitious as a quite small organisation, and we're, the word innovative is thrown around a lot, but I genuinely believe that we are innovative. I think people build a relationship with us personally too. Like people know my name, they know who I am, they will come to me, they will have conversations, they will ask me about my life because they know me, and I share a part of myself to them and they share it with me, because a lot of what our volunteers do is incredibly personal in a lot of ways. They're sharing really deep personal experiences, which I can only imagine is potentially quite emotionally, it makes you quite emotionally vulnerable if you're talking about your experience of diagnosis. We've done a whole series on animated symptoms, and there's a whole piece around kind of sexual dysfunction, and that's a really difficult thing to share with you. People are laying out really personal parts of their lives. The least we can do is build that relationship and give part of ourselves to them as well. So people know us by name and they'll ask for us, which again, I'm sure some volunteer managers will absolutely resonate with. And I remember National Trust did a huge piece of work, I can't remember the university now that they worked with, which was about that emotional resilience of volunteer managers. But one of the things that they found was that volunteers, if somebody left, if a volunteer manager left, or if a staff member left that they had a close connection with, they would often find that those volunteers would also drift off, because whilst the connection might also be to National Trust, often it was to a person and to an individual as well. So there is a bit of a fine line sometimes that you have to walk between how much they care about the cause. I think for us that's really strong because everybody has MS, but also like how they feel about the people who work within that organisation as well.
Yeah, that study, by the way, was Leicester, and then later on Leicester de Montfort University. If anybody wants to look it up, if I can find the notes, I'll put it in the blurb for this episode. But yeah, it was a good piece of research. Do you ever think about involving non-MSers in the energy?
Yeah, every now and then. We used to have an amazing program called MS Reporters, which is essentially people with MS going out and being kind of reporting almost in the field, with normally healthcare professionals, with the idea being trying to level the playing field. And instead of healthcare professionals being on this sort of pedestal and you being maybe a bit worried about asking questions, you basically would funnel it through this reporter who would go out and ask those questions. Obviously, the person asking the questions, we felt had to have MS. There was no discussion about that. I was like, this person absolutely has to have MS, otherwise it just feels really disingenuous. But the person behind the camera, there was an opportunity there for that to be somebody that didn't have MS. That could be somebody who, whether they have a background in filming or editing or sound, or it could even be friend or family member of that individual. So we did have that opportunity, and partly that was because that was actually quite a in-person, in a specific location piece of work, although that did change, particularly in various lockdowns. I think because at the moment our service is for people with MS, we don't see there being huge opportunities for people that don't have MS. But that doesn't mean that that's not possible. And we do have debates internally about kind of like If we need a specific skill, does it matter if that person has MS or not? And I think it's done on a case by case basis, but there are currently no people that don't have MS that are volunteers with us. There've been one or two sort of in the past when we've needed some kind of really specific support in a certain area, but at the moment, not so much. It's that, is it a specific skill? Is it healthcare professionals? That we could, there's a really valid argument for that, I think. And obviously we've seen some healthcare professionals who have given their time as class them as broadly volunteers in the past. So I think there's definitely times when we would not, we would involve people who don't have MS.
And do you think, I'm just interested in what other charities can learn from that kind of model as well, because lots of healthcare charities, I mean, all of them do amazing stuff, but many are still providing services for people with various health conditions or with disabilities, opposed to being really truly driven by those individual, those service beneficiaries, if you like, in at the heart of shaping, designing, testing, and delivering the services. Have you got any views on why more charities don't shift further into that zone?
I love to use the word scared. I don't know. I do feel like I've kind of talked about loss of control at the start. Again, I guess I'm talking about probably more established charities. I mean, there's always lots to talk about co-production. Co-production is a bit of a buzzword. It probably has been for a very long time. And I feel like sometimes we worry so much about what the co-production looks like. We have to have this document that tells us how we work with people, and we have to have these edges, and it has to go through compliance. It's the processes. I really struggle with that because I don't have those restrictions in a lot of ways. I think when you're a smaller, agile organization, you can be like, let's try this thing, let's risk assessment. Okay, yeah, actually, like if it all goes terribly wrong, it's not going to be the end of the world. But if you are a really big organization and you have, you don't want to get dragged through, the front pages or any sort of news agency. I think, again, I've talked about National Trust before, but I feel like them RNLI, I'm sure, have been dragged through them at various different times as well. There's been a big hoo-ha in the US about the National MS Society letting go of a volunteer. And I think we just worry so much about that we try and do as much damage control, and that prevents us from trying something a bit different. I think we worry so much about the risks rather than the opportunities and the potential benefits that it could have, that it maybe stops us from trying some new things. Like I said, if you've already got a volunteer program in place, we've kind of talked about retrofit because that's what we've always done. So why would we start from zero? We'll start from where we are and try and squish it in.
It's hard to turn like oil tankers around sometimes, to continue the metaphor. Maybe like the smaller organizations are more nimble. They have a smaller turning circle potentially as well. And the effort required to drive that change is always challenging, right? How much to put into that to get the change. I think sometimes like it's an interesting thought exercise, or something I've certainly wondered at points, going, how much do we need to invest getting what we've got now to where we want it to be, versus how much we need to invest to start something really new, but have to make that work with something that already exists, or not have that thing that exists even, continuing to exist, if that makes sense. All of that can be quite challenging and difficult, I think. I guess it's like the challenge of change, right? That we all have to think about, and and where we are on that journey and what we want to put into it, I suppose.
And I do think it is a culture and a leadership thing as well. Like, if an organization doesn't live and breathe it at the top levels, why on earth would anybody else do it? It's and I feel, again, from experience, and I don't know if you both feel the same, but volunteering is just kind of this thing that happens. I know it's great and it happens, and you don't need trained professionals to do it. It's just kind of, again, this is my idea of sort of the word volunteer and what that conjures up for people. And I don't think people fully appreciate the amount of work, effort, emotional resilience that goes into having a program where you're involving, whether it's huge amounts of people or not that many people, it doesn't matter. I think that the impact is kind of still the same. And I always found it sort of a little bit like, it feels like volunteer management should be, it's people, and people are so important, and they're the lifeblood of every organization. So why would it be any different? Why is HR elevated and volunteers are demoted, in the grand scheme of the hierarchy? And if at that top level your leaders aren't working alongside volunteers with their beneficiaries, with lived experience leaders, why would anybody else do it? And it's an ongoing conflict that I don't quite know how we resolve, but we need that buy-in from that top level, because otherwise I just can't see how it's going to filter down. And you lead by example. So we're always trying to work with people. Our chief exec is always working with people. I mean, he has MS himself, so he kind of, that inherently happens. But all of our team do, because we expect them to. And if they don't, we have questions about why they're not speaking to people with MS. Why are you not working with people with MS? You don't have MS, so why are you not doing that? And I think, again, we're really lucky that our demographic of our board is really good. There's really great MS representation on there as well. So that is kind of that top level. We have people who have lived experience directly. We have people who have partners with MS, family, etc. People who work with MS as well. So we've got a really broad range and diverse board, which really helps as well, because they set the expectation from the get-go.
Feels like it's something to be said there about just staying really true to your principles. Actually, it would be really easy to compromise some of that, right? But actually, there's sort of leadership decisions being made there about what the principles are, and holding the line on that and staying really true to them, and then also, from what I can tell, reaping the rewards of that as well. So yeah, that sounds really,
kind of comes back to brand, right? in a lot of ways, brand, beliefs, all of those kind of, whatever that looks like in your organization, by MSers for MSers is just such a key message for us that we all know it. It's just something that we say inherently, and same with our beliefs as well. We only have two, and one of them is we believe in the power of community to help MSers actively manage their health. If to live that belief, we have to involve the community, otherwise we're not living and breathing those things.
Well, it's been great to hear the story behind Shift.MS and the energy. Matt and I have been following the organisation for some time, admiring your work, and it's so refreshing to hear such innovation, maybe because of the relative youth of your charity being quite new, and your roots in the creative industry and digital arena. It seems you break the mold of volunteering, and there's so much that we can all learn in our organisations from your example. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
So, Chris, what another interesting conversation. The energy, I think that's really interesting. Use of language, I think another really interesting kind of take on how important branding and marketing is to volunteering and getting people involved. It feels like Shift.MS are really an organisation that understands what they're doing, who they're doing it for, who they're trying to attract, and really creating a really key marketing campaign and set of materials that are going to bring people in. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, clearly a really purpose-driven organisation, and I don't just mean purpose in terms of what they want to achieve, but they know who they are and what they want to do and how they want to do it, and they're really driven, and with that, aren't allowing established barriers and risks to unnecessarily stand in the way of what they're doing. It feels to me they've not got that baggage. They're saying, this is what we want to do, let's find a way to do it, and then cracking on with it, which is refreshing, actually, I think, to hear.
Yeah, totally. And I think, like that kind of purpose seems to run through the organisation like a total kind of stick of rock, doesn't it? Like the by people with MS, for people with MS, not getting bogged down in, the ins and outs and the theory of co-production and how we work together with the community, but just cracking on, just doing it, really reaping the rewards of that. That's so exciting, and I think something that we should all be thinking more about, really. I mean, certainly, you know, I've spent time over the years thinking about and theorizing about the best approach to co-production. Like, you know, I was feeling a bit guilty when Amy was saying that, because I've certainly been one of those people going, we must do this perfectly, we must do this by the book. And actually what I probably should have been doing is just going, let's just try some stuff. Let's just get it going. Rushing is the word for sure. I thought another thing that was really interesting was the whole kind of importance of relationships and personality in the organization. And another shout out for the handbook, right? Like of the energy at Shift.MS. Just read it. But I think one of the things that again is so interesting in it is on like basically the last page is a thank you note, which, hey, look, thanking volunteers is really important. The page before that is a contact page, and it has pictures of the whole team on it. And it's really personal. It's about making connections with people, and that, you know, that also seems to be a key part of their brand. You know, who people are, what they do, pictures, what it's like to work there, what it's like to be part of the community. So key to what they're doing.
Yeah, another fantastic episode, I think, if I do say so myself. So anybody's and hopefully everybody has enjoyed listening to the conversation today. We want more guests like that, I think it's fair to say. We've got a few lined up, but we always want more ideas. So if you've got an idea on who to invite along, who you'd like to hear from in the future, or maybe you want to come on yourself and tell us your story, do get in touch. Email is podcast@timeforimpact.co.uk. Any ideas, suggestions, feedback, always gratefully received. Most importantly, as everybody says on every podcast you ever listen to, please do subscribe, sign up, and make sure you don't miss any future episodes. And for now, that's it from us, and we'll hopefully speak to you soon in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.